Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us on a humid summer evening here in London. And welcome to you from whichever part of the world that you're in. It's lovely to see so many new faces and names in the list that I've just looked at, and to also recognize old and very, very dear friends. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to firstly thank the Master of St. Benet's Hall, Professor Richard Cooper, for co-hosting this event with Faith in Leadership. Richard will be speaking towards the end of this evening's proceedings. If I can just make a few housekeeping points. Firstly, if you're able to keep your camera on during the event, I would be very, very grateful. It makes this electronic experience a little more human. We ask that you please remain on mute in the plenary space, but unmute yourself as soon as we are in the breakout session. Our event is being recorded and will be posted on the St. Benet's web channel in due course. Please do type your questions and post them in the Zoom chat facility at any stage. We aren't likely to be able to cover all points, but I have a team of colleagues who will relay selected questions to me. If I call your name, please do be ready to unmute yourself in order to put your question directly to us. Normally, we encourage interactive exercises at Faith in Leadership meetings. So during and at the end of our session, we'll have the option to meet in the discussion rooms to discuss thoughts provoked by today's conversation. Now, to remind us, the context for this meeting is Britain's presidency of COP26, the Global Environmental Summit that will convene in Glasgow in 2 months' time. In his foreword to the COP26 program, the minister in charge of the conference, Alok Sharma, writes, the COVID pandemic has brought devastation to millions around the world, disrupting many parts of the global economy. But climate change has continued, and it ultimately threatens life on Earth. That from a government minister. The latest Intergovernmental Panel report on climate change report released this month goes to town in describing this threat and refers to the intensification of the impacts we are witnessing now: droughts, wildfires, record downpours and temperatures, melting ice, the extinction of species, the undoing of the last many decades of poverty relief, a devastation of the global poor, and interconnected in our vulnerability, severe suffering by the global rich. People of faith make up over 80% of our world's population. Our religions teach us to care for the earth and each other, but how practically might faith leaders find the courage to contribute to the flourishing of our planet at this time? How can faith teachings and communities help us all to make meaningful behavioral changes for the sake of the planet? Can they encourage the adoption of a care economy, which, according to Pope Francis, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and Archbishop Justin in their joint statement of this week, calls on everyone, whatever their belief or worldview, to work together and take responsibility for how we use the world's resources and to choose people-centered profits instead of our current system? How do we deal with the theology of climate denial? In what ways does faith matter to the UN system anyway? It is up to us in the next while to unearth precious responses to these and other questions from our wise and distinguished panelists. Their biographies only capture a fraction of what makes them remarkable people. So if I may, I'd like to present here just one or two things about them that I find particularly meaningful. Geoffrey Lean is arguably the founder of environmental journalism, having pioneered reporting on the subject over 50 years ago. As a rookie reporter for the Yorkshire Post, his writings made it lawful to identify factories that pollute rivers for the first time in Britain. Since then, he has won the Scoop of the Year in both the National and London Press Club Awards, has worked as contributing editor and freelancer for many of the UK's main newspapers. He was instrumental in forging the link between climate change and international development. He has been persecuted for speaking truth to the environmental lobby as well as to governments and industry. I have personally seen ministers of the Crown quake in his presence, and his writings have enabled the public at large to become aware of such issues as the depletion of the ozone layer to the potential dangers of GM foods. I could go on, but it's in his biography. I remember being moved, if I could just be personal for a bit, by a ITV documentary, which I saw as a young man, in which he vividly described his being in a coma for a month. He also speaks of being a quadriplegic for 6 months after an operation went wrong, and he has survived tongue cancer. He doesn't talk about it much, but I know that he believes in the power of scientific medicine and the power of prayer. And that, you'll find, is the longest introduction I will give to any of our panel. He's lived longer than the rest of them, so I know that he'll forgive that. Karen Agor is the director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary, where her focus is on what she says is the deep mindset that explains how and why we find ourselves in the current climate crisis. She also talks about the changes we need to make in public consciousness in order to create a new value system based on the long-term well-being of all people and the planet. She is also the author of an incredibly well-researched and well-written book that she wrote as a young person, Lighting the Way: 9 Women Who Changed Modern America, that chronicles the lives of heroines, but fascinatingly, ones who were signs of contradiction in their era and were ahead of their times on such issues as civil and equal rights, public health, and environmental protection, and indeed were ridiculed and persecuted as a result. In her book and subsequent appearances in the media, she seems to give dignity to dissent and disruption. And in talking with me on the phone in preparation for these meetings, on such matters as the theological roots of the climate crisis, the environmental consequences of the rise of Western industrialization, and the concomitant fall of indigenous civilizations, and the propensity of good to masquerade as, the propensity of evil to masquerade as good in our polities. I'm pretty sure that she too is ahead of her time. Gopal Patel is the founder and director of Bhumi Global, the environmental platform for Hindu Dharmic climate change. He's also the co-chair of the United Nations Interfaith Advisory Panel, and a consultant who advises a whole number of influential clients on how they might better engage with the UN system. His reach is global, and you'll find folks who are either employed by him or advised by him in the most unlikely places, whether it is a seminar on business and industry in Panchgani, India, or a reception with the late Duke of Edinburgh at Windsor Castle. I should say that he is an alumnus of one of the first Faith in Leadership programs. He has emerged. It's for emerging faith leaders, that program, so he's emerged. And we are thrilled at the levels he is working in now. No doubt, Gopal, Karena, and Jeff would hold the floor without our interventions, but I'll pose a few questions to get things started before it's over to you. And can I remind everyone that please, go ahead and post questions in the chat. So, Jeff, could I start with you? How has your environmental journalism over half a century made a difference on the ground?
Well, I hope it has. I don't know, really, I sort of feel very privileged and rather humbled by this whole thing, because there's only once every generation or so that a journalist is given to a journalist to really start and establish a new speciality. There was a famous one at the Observer in the 1950s, who really established writing about economics. And for, by total coincidence, it was given to me to do that for the environment. And to my amazement, I've lived to see environment correspondence become almost as populous as economic correspondence. And maybe they'll take over in the future. But it all began back in 1970, which is a thing called European Conservation Year, which everyone's forgotten except for me, because it changed my life. And the editor of my first newspaper, I just joined a couple of weeks before, the Yorkshire Post, asked me to take it on. And I wasn't at all enthusiastic. I'd seen myself as being a big political correspondent or a foreign correspondent or something, maybe even an economics one. But I hadn't got any choice, so I had to do it. And I soon became hooked. You know, it was coming up for the Stockholm conference. There were special issues of the Time and Newsweek, which was an extremely important issue, and also clearly a moral issue, which is very interesting. Indeed, some of the early pioneers were talking about how what was needed was a moral and spiritual revolution to cope with the coming environmental crisis. People like Barbara Ward, E.F. Schumacher, Maurice Strong. Now, the faith totally failed to pick this up. I mean, no response whatsoever, really. Though personally, a lot of people did. And over the years, I've found an enormous number of the most active people. When you scratch them, you find there's a faith there. And the same is true of me. I'm a sort of rather non-institutional Christian, but I don't think I would have picked it up or kept at it without that grounding. And because it's not the way to fame, wasn't the way to fame and fortune. It may become so now, but it wasn't then. And for a very long time, I wasn't the first, but I was the only one in Britain. So I'd meet the entire environment press corps in the shaving mirror every morning. And then gradually more and more people joined. But I was also very lucky always to have editors who let me campaign. So my very first one was slightly aligned to what Chris said. Where the rivers in Yorkshire, where I started work on the Yorkshire Post, were very polluted. It wasn't possible to name them. We wanted to name them, but that was to break the law. You could put enough poison in the local river to poison the whole of Leeds, but and you'd get a fine. But if I reported it or somebody, a pollution official, told me about it, we were both liable to go to jail under a thing called the Pollution Prevention of Rivers Act. But there was a loophole, which was that you could comment on the rivers. So we took samples above and below each polluter and said above such ICI, for example, the river is absolutely pure. Beneath it, it is highly polluted. And as far as we know, the only effluent between the two is ICI. And that named them. And 22 of the 23 we named started cleaning up within the year. So that was a start, a very interesting start. And then there are other things. I mean,
can I just pause you? I mean, that happened in his first job. Can you imagine? As first, yeah.
That was 1971, 72, yes. And then you see, there was a local factory which had made asbestos where where it really hadn't been enforced. At last, in asbestos factories around the world, and we reported on that. Now, no credit to me, but it was a new man. They just had a new member of parliament, and he picked it up and pushed it and really campaigned on it. And the British Ombudsman took it up. As a result of that, the standard for asbestos changed in Britain and then around the world, so that it actually became impossible to work with it. So it became banned over large areas of the world. Not my work, I just have coincidental, but through the work of this member of parliament. And then there are other things like, I mean, you asked me for cases, but I'm quite associated with getting lead out of petrol in Britain. There were many, many other people involved doing much more. But just last week, it was announced that lead, and that was now out of petrol worldwide, which, tremendously gratifying. We started campaigning for grants in the countryside in Britain to be more associated to conservation rather than just maximizing production. And again, that's now going into law in Britain now. We did a bit about ozone and the Montreal Protocol, telling the ozone there, campaigned strongly for aid when Mrs. Thatcher wanted to cut it, so on and so forth. So it was a tremendous privilege to be able to do that and to have the editors who supported it and to be able to see things change on the ground. I don't know if it's true the minister that, as Chris said, the ministers quaked in my presence, but there was one prime minister who did go on record saying he did read me religiously. And so I was writing for him quite a lot. And sometimes you see things changing the next day, which again was a terrific privilege to be able to do. Of course, it wasn't all plain sailing. I'm very proud to have been fired by both the most left-wing newspaper in Britain and the most right-wing newspaper in Britain for the same reason each time, and sticking to my last. There are lots of people who opposed what I was doing, both in my profession and elsewhere. I think the thing was that as a journalist, you have the chance to be a bridge between politicians who often want to do things that feel they have no support, and the public who feels that things need doing, but they don't have the power to do it. And if you can create that bridge, then things happen. You give the politicians courage, and you empower the public.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a great place to pause for the time being. We'll return. That's a wonderful opening salvo. Thank you. I saw the minister quake. I was with him. A number of people have shadowed Jeff over when they were young. I was privileged to be one of them, and I've seen the impact that he has on people in power. Okay, Karena, talking of power, you have seen the worlds of politics and environmentalism really firsthand. You write movingly about your 3rd birthday party being celebrated and on the campaign trail. You've also been a lawyer, but you use theology as a way now of bridging these worlds to make a difference, on the ground. Could you comment on how this choice? Why theology?
Thank you so much, Krish, and thank you to everybody here. I'm really honored to be included in this conversation. Thank you for that particular question. I am indeed from a political family in the United States, and I grew up also in the wake of the civil rights movement here in the 1960s, which was a source of inspiration, and it did bridge theology and politics itself, and sort of loomed large in my sense of the possibilities of politics when I was growing up. But as a young adult, I found the experience of politics in the late 1990s and early 2000s to be extremely dispiriting and disillusioning. And of course, one reason is that politics is prone to focus on the short term. Politicians are looking to be elected or reelected in the next election cycle. It's also accountable, particularly in the US, to the most powerful, loudest interests. And this is in order to get the votes needed to be reelected, but it's also true that they need money for the political ads and for the political apparatus, and the money comes from donations. And on top of this, in my lifetime, and I was born in 1973, we've seen this rise of a kind of ethos that really draws from business and markets to talk about all of the things of the civic sphere. And so I was noticing in my life and in my experience in politics that long-term often loses out to short-term. Those things that aren't backed by those moneyed interests lose out. And I also noticed the confusion of money and virtue that is so embedded in our culture on so many levels. The way people talk about success in terms of individual success, as well as collective success and national success. And so I think that it's important to note that there are moral claims made in civic discourse, in political discourse, all the time, even if they're not identified or interrogated as such. Every political speech has them. They're just not usually examined. And so even the last administration in the US, their relentless call for energy dominance is a good example. It was designed to appeal to some deeper sense of collectively held meaning that was associated with what was right and good, or great, as the case may have been. And might makes right is itself a moral claim that we cannot just look at as invisible. And I think it's important to note, and I won't go on too long. I know, Krish, thank you. You'll cut me off when I have, but that there is a note here of an echo of the confusion of the concept of dominion which is so central to the Abrahamic religions from the book of Genesis, with domination and dominance. And there is a history which was encapsulated in a thesis that was done in 1967 by an American historian of medieval Europe, Lynn White, that talked about the defeat of animism and paganism by Christianity, a version of Christianity aligned with mercantilism, as the biggest psychic revolution in the history of humanity. And he talks specifically about that notion of dominion and imago Dei, that only humans are made in the image of God, being used to take out the sense of sacred within the natural world. And I do believe that that is very much at play in the culture war. There's a kind of deep, almost cellular fear of paganism as something that is evil. And if something seems to view nature as sacred, there's a kind of resistance to that. So the theologian Paul Tillich, who is at Union Theological Seminary, where the Center for Earth Ethics, where I work, is based, talked about the essence of religion as a sense of the ultimate concern. And mainly that ultimate concern has actually been economic growth. Measurements of GDP, stock market, the simplistic jobs reports are often held up as the way that we look at economic growth. And I think it's important to note that this is really trumpeted as a moral mandate without looking at the fact that it is a means to an end for what most people truly believe is most important, which would be belonging, well-being, health, family, fairness, beauty, balance, integrity. And so we can see that when these deepest human yearnings are left out of political discourse, actually, and particularly progressive political discourse, then they are quickly snatched up and distorted by forces of demagoguery. People are left vulnerable. And there is this concept from theology I think is important. I know Cynthia Mo-Labeda, a theologian who was drawing on the work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and talked about structural evil. One of the key characteristics of structural evil is that it easily masquerades as good. So when you're looking at the forces behind ecological destruction, they don't often come out and say, well, we're just about greed and money for the top earners in the world. They come out and say, we're for ending energy poverty, we're for jobs, we're for these things that have a moral mandate associated with them. So our job as ethicists, as religious leaders, as citizens, is to think more deeply about what those moral claims are. So the definition of faith that I have always really liked from scripture, from Hebrews, is that substance of things hoped for and evidence of things unseen. And we know that this system that we're living in now, that has brought us to this point, does not measure the real costs. There is not the accounting. The gross domestic product doesn't count pollution, depletion, inequality, the long-term benefits of conserving for culture, for health, for well-being, for community. And so even though we don't count those things as a society, they're still real. They're unseen by the system, but they are still real. The voice of the earth is actually speaking that truth in these climate impacts, which we're seeing, which are causing so much devastation and suffering. And the resistance, even now, to seeing that is really, it really is also evidence of something else, which is that this is not about just data and science and technology and economics. This is not about common sense or logic. If it were, we would have made progress. We would be on our way to the world that the Paris Agreement envisions. As it is, we are far off those targets, because instead this is about values and belief systems, and meaning. And I really am so delighted, honored to be part of this, because I know and respect the voices here to be able to get to the meaning involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karana. Gopal, Karana just referred to the sacredness inherent in creation. I mean, that is Hinduism. What impelled you to start Bhumi Global, and how does faith work with the United Nations? Is it actually possible, or is it a ruse to do that? Please.
Yeah, thank you, Krish. It's a pleasure to be with the FIL community. Again, as you said, I was part of the second batch. Maybe I was a guinea pig back then, but it's good to be with all of you again. Yeah, Bhumi, as you mentioned, Bhumi Global works with Hindu groups globally on climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. And the reason we do the work we do is because in many ways we see ourselves as a Hindu institution for the 21st century. There are two realities that we engage with. The first is that we see within young Hindus in the diaspora and also in Hindu majority countries like India and in Guyana and other places, that there's a decrease. There's people do not want to be associated anymore with mainstream religious institutions, and we see that decline in the West, in the Abrahamic traditions, but we also see that in Hinduism as well, that young Hindus no longer want to practice their faith maybe in the way that their parents did or grandparents taught them to. They want to make it their own. And they find in many ways that the current existing Hindu structures or institutions don't speak to their values or how they want to show up in the world. And so they, in many ways, I've spoken to people here in the United States and in England, in many ways, they fall through the gaps because they don't want to go to temple. They don't want to follow certain lifestyle practices. And so they don't know where to go. And so they integrate with mainstream society, but still maintaining their Hindu identity. And so there's a significant number of Hindus like that we feel in the world, specifically in the younger generation. And the second reality is that climate change is an existential threat to human life, to well-being, and to all life on Earth. I think maybe a theologian from Union calls it a wicked threat. It's so overwhelming. And so how to bring these two realities together, where Hindus, as you said, Krish, inherently, as in all major faith traditions, care about the planet, care about Mother Earth, Bhumi Devi, Matra Bhumi, want to do something to protect and serve her, but find limited avenues through which to do that. And so what Bhumi Global does is we try to bring those Hindus together to say, come as you are. We're not going to ask you to worship a particular deity in Hinduism. We're not going to ask you to go on certain kind of pilgrimages or do certain kind of practices. Come as you are, bring what you have, and let's work together through the lens of what Hinduism has to offer when it comes to caring for the earth, to do something collectively within our own communities, in our families, but also with other faith traditions as well. And not to boast or anything, but I think we have something there. And I think we have something there because we can see parallel institutions in other faith groups. You see Jewish organizations like that, Christian organizations like that, Muslim groups. So you see other faith traditions have these non-religious, faith-based development organizations, let's say. And within the Hindu community, and I would also say in the broader Dharmic group communities, they are significantly lacking or non-existent. And so that's what we really try to do with our work within Bhumi Global. And one way we do that, as you mentioned there, Krish, is we do a lot of work within the United Nations. We currently serve as the co-chair of the UN's Multi-Faith Advisory Council, which is a 40-member body appointed by the UN of the world's largest and most respected faith-based development organizations. And that council is there to advise and support and assist the United Nations when it wants to work with faith-based organizations on its development goals. My focus is the environment. And so what I do through the council and through other coalitions at the UN is try to bring a faith-based perspective to environmental policies the United Nations are developing. And if I give you just one very quick example of like why it's important and how that can be done, we're talking about climate change right now, which is coming up in 2 weeks, the COP in Glasgow. But there's another major conference taking place later this year. It is another COP. It's a COP on biodiversity. There's a climate change crisis. There's a biodiversity crisis. And the current biodiversity framework, which is being developed by the UN, is so anthropocentric. It focuses the narrative on nature is only important because it provides well-being to people, and it's an economic resource, a natural resource to people. Now, we know from a Hindu perspective, a Dharmic perspective, indigenous perspective, and other perspectives, that framing is why we're in this problem to begin with, that separation. And so what we're doing at the UN with about 50 other different faith-based organizations is pushing to say, this paradigm has to change. We can no longer look at nature as separate, as inert, as something for us to exploit and enjoy. We have to recognize the inherent spiritual value of the natural world and protect it for that reason, not only because it provides us something. Now, that's a framing that comes directly out of faith-based organizations, and it's a framing that the UN and the scientists struggle to engage with. And so that's why it's so important for faith-based institutions to engage at the UN, but also at a national government level and also local as well, to bring in these perspectives. Because as Corinna was saying, when we talk about policy and politics, there are moral framings there that we just accept, that we don't challenge. And I think time has come where faith-based institutions really need to step up and critically engage and push policy and governments to reflect the worldviews that those elected leaders claim to represent. So that's partly the reason who we are and what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gopal. So I wanted to just invite three dear friends who are faith and thought leaders. And if Julie can put them up, is Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, Dr. Jagber Jyoti Johal, and Imam Qari Asim. I just wondered, is there anything, having heard our speakers, is there anything that you would like to respond to from the vantage of your faith communities? Rabbi Wittenberg, please.
Thank you. It's the most enormous privilege to be part of this conversation. It can feel like I've arrived in a conversation that my life is for. Every word resonates. And I just want to pick up a couple of moments from Jewish tradition, and then I want to ask a question. We've just finished our new year, in which we describe the day as the birthday of the world. But there's a word play on this. The word, the birthday, can also mean the day the world trembles. And both, one feels full of wonder and love of creation and full of terror. And it all hangs in the balance, and it feels it depends on our generations now. And I was particularly engaged by what you, Corinna, said about dominion. So much misunderstood. But the rabbis elaborate the scene when Noah is building the ark. And they have him in argument with his contemporaries who say, well, if the water is coming from above, we've got kind of metal plates we can put above our heads. If it's coming from below, we can cover the earth with a lid. And they fail, as if to say, technology won't do it. And the notion of human dominion over nature collapses. And after the flood, when God makes this new covenant, it is three-way between me, between you, and between all living beings. And there's a strong sense there of partnership, the sacredness of all life, not anthropocentric. On the contrary, the role of the human being is to carry a responsibility of being between the divine and every other form of life and dependent on both. And I imagine that's something we deeply share. Trying to build this sort of understanding in different faith communities, something troubles me and really frustrates me. Use the word just now, Gopal, I think critically engage power. Sometimes with COP coming, it feels like standing outside Kafka's castle, asking for the way in. How on earth does one bring real influence to bear to change policies among those who are so influenced by exactly the features of short-termism and monetary interest that have been so articulately expressed here?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Dr. Jagber Jyoti Johal, please.
Thank you for having me. I was moved by all of the presentations and just reflecting on them, thinking about it from the Sikh perspective. And I think some of the things that I just want to kind of flag up, and I've made some notes. As faith communities, we recognize the environmental issues and the profound implications for future generations and human well-being. And rather than the repercussions of environmental change simply being a theoretical issue, as faith communities, we are seeing these concerns as survival issues for those who are living throughout the world. And as faith communities, we are aware of the loss and damage caused to the environment, and in turn, especially the negative economic impacts, particularly on developing countries, for example, where people experience that economic, but also the non-economic losses and damage on their communities, infrastructure, and natural environment. And one of the things that I was thinking about is these impacts lead to harm to human health, poverty, hunger, disease, but also there's a loss in terms of cultural heritage and traditions due to people movement in response to climate impact. And we need to kind of also focus on that, particularly in the current debate around migration, illegal immigrants and everything. In the UK context, I'm just thinking. As a woman of faith and as a Sikh, I'm very conscious of how Punjab has been affected by the climate change. Failure of the Green Revolution and the negative impact that this has had on the land of Punjab. But also the impact that it has had on fellow Sikhs, for example, such as the increasing farmers' suicides due to debt and poor crops, and then the gendered impact that this also has. Punjab has shown me that we cannot assume that environmental change affects everyone similarly, right? It affects everyone, but also, but sometimes it affects the marginalized in different ways. We have to recognize the difference and how it often does make women and young people more vulnerable, and they have a unique experience as environmental refugees or due to food insecurity. So just thinking along those lines, I reflect on the Sikh teachings in terms of guidance on how we should respect and appreciate the world around us. And we can draw on various verses from Sikh scripture to guide us on how to live in harmony with the environment, because every creature in this world, every planet, every form is created by the Creator and is a manifestation of that Creator. And I'm just going to read out a verse. You yourself are the bumblebee, the flower, the fruit, and the tree. You yourself are the water, the desert, the ocean, and the pool. You yourself are the great fish, the tortoise, the cause of causes. Your form cannot be known. So that highlights to us that God is dwelling in all of his creation, right? And Sikh scripture teaches us to revere the earth as a dharamsal, a sacred place established by God to practice dharma and rightful living. And within that concept, I'm reminded of how Sikhs therefore are aware and conscious that we are stewards and custodians who have a shared moral and ethical responsibility to safeguard and protect all of human life. All life. Sarbat Dapala is the term that comes to mind. And live in harmony with nature, because human and environmental health are mutually dependent. And I think that's very important that we have to recognize. And Sikhs have long been known for engaging in social justice and civic action. And that's a social justice and civic action you can see within the political arena with reference to human inequality and everything. But we are now seeing that within the realm of environmental change and everything. But I would just flag up, and we can discuss these later, but there are examples of, there's Eco Baba, I don't know whether you've heard of him, there's Sant Balbir Singh Sichwal, and he's known for rejuvenating the river Bain in India. So as one man on a mission to clear this river, kind of then brought a community along with him in Punjab to create that environmental change. And then I also think we have Eco Synagogue, but we have Eco Sikh, and who have adopted the Khalsa ideal concept of the eco warrior. So they, in a couple of years back, with reference to the 550th birth anniversary of Guru Nanak, developed projects like the Million Tree Project, but are also working towards making Gurdwaras environmentally friendly. in an attempt to address environmental change, but also social justice and everything. And one final example in terms of the Sikh activism, I think I would like to kind of highlight is an organization called Karma Grow in Canada. And it's a Canadian-based organization, which is a community garden which provides food to food banks. Right, so we have like the churches, we have the gurdwaras providing food, but they've kind of gone down the route of having a garden to provide organic produce, right? So their impact that they can have on this whole environmental.
Thanks, Jagber.
So I think that's something
fascinating. No, thank you, and I'm so sorry to cut you off. Thank you, Imam Kariasim. By the way, before you say, just the bios of our distinguished faith respondents are in the chat. Kari, please.
Thank you, Krish. First of all, I'd really like to thank all the panelists who enlightened us in terms of the crisis, but also what's happening and how we can make a difference. I very much agree with all the panelists. I think I would like to share some reflections from my faith, Islam. So the Quranic worldview is that God created the planet, sustained life on it, and appointed human beings as stewards. And so this really runs through, as I mentioned earlier, a thread through Abrahamic faiths, but it's quite central to our faith in the sense that this concept of stewardship or being a trustee then ought to be reflected in all of our actions. The general outlook of Quranic paradigm on utilizing natural environment is based on prohibition of aggression and misuse, and the preservation of natural resources is an integral part of faith. And so as a Muslim, it gives me huge pain to see colossal environmental injustice that is being done to our home planet, over which humans were appointed as guardians. There are examples from our faith where, God says in the scripture that corruption has arisen in the land and in the sea, and it's all due to the doings of humans. And so the trustees that were appointed to be vigilant and also to show care towards the rest of creation have actually caused this corruption. So the responsibility to protect ecological balance, biodiversity, and sustainability of all forms of life on Earth is mentioned by the Prophet himself when he says that the earth is green and beautiful and God has appointed you his stewards over it, so take care of it. And so what we're doing in terms of just focusing on some of the activism that's happening in Britain across the Muslim community is that firstly, we're trying to raise awareness through Friday sermons, awareness of the teachings of our faith, but also trying to see how we as individuals can bring about lifestyle changes to make a difference, albeit a small difference, but at least it starts from home. And secondly, there are now a number of mosques in the UK that have brought about changes, either in terms of the what the services that they offer, whether it's all the way from lighting to cutlery that's used to obviously the first eco-friendly mosque in Cambridge that's been built. So that's given a huge inspiration to many of the mosques across the country. And just before COVID, there was a real trend, especially in Ramadan, when Muslims fast and are more vigilant towards their responsibilities. It was bringing about that when service users are anywhere from 200 to 2,000 people that are using the services of the mosque, that how can we instill those key principles to bring about changes in our lives to protect the planet. So it just remains to see how we can carry that forward after COVID. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So unless any of our panelists want to make a quick response, is there anyone you want to respond right now? That just indicate with your hand. Okay, so I'll make just one announcement, and then we'll go into groups for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back, and I'm hoping that you'll put questions in the chat, and we will have a to and fro on the basis of that. But I just wanted to say to those of you who are wondering where Charlotte Bannister Parker is, she was advertised as being part of our panel. Unfortunately, a intimate family member is very seriously ill, and so she's had to withdraw. So she was meant to facilitate this discussion, and I am a poor replacement for her. So with that, can we go into groups for 15 minutes? And really, what is the responsibility of faith and leadership in the environment? What is the responsibility of faith to the environment? And what can we do to support the COP process? Or is, the speakers have given, all the speakers so far have given us clues, but, and faith can mobilize and influence the heart and behaviors of, vast swathes of people. So if this is the case, why hasn't it happened already? So these kind of tantalizing questions, please, you have 15 minutes to consider, and then we'd just love to hear your views when you come back and have a discussion with our panelists. But please, the way we'll do it is that if you could put your question or kind of some indication of what the points you'd like to make in the chat, I will then call on you, and you'll be able to so we'll be able to see you. But as I say, we'll go into groups randomly selected, and I hope you'll have a constructive dialogue in those groups. Go ahead, Julie.
Okay, off you go.
Thank you, and I'm so sorry to interrupt your discussions just when they were about to get going, and then we broke them. But we can continue here. So please do put your points in the chat function, and we'll refer to them in due course. Jeff, did you want to just summarize the discussion that the panel was having about young people? Particularly, and your own experience of the children of political leaders?
Well, I was just saying, during one of the worst times during the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which we all expected, I've never known a summit open with such optimism and then go downhill so fast. There's a lot of reasons for it. But at one point in the middle of it, I was saying to a friend, when are the young going to speak up? When are the young going to say, how dare you do this to our future? That'll be the turning point. And little did I know it, but sort of 10 years later, the 16-year-old autistic girl from Sweden, not the person you'd pick if you were trying to choose something, humanly, appears and does just that and mobilizes a generation. And I think it's done an enormous amount to change the political atmosphere, certainly in my country and in many other countries too, because the young are mobilized. And what people in power, I think, what changes them most is mobilization. It is the public becoming concerned and becoming active. And any influence I ever had was not because of anything I wrote particularly or any wisdom on my part, but because I was speaking to millions of people every week or every day. And I was saying, my greatest allies very often were my editor's children, who could sort of go home when their kids were out on the environment and say, well, we've got this fellow anyway. Very often political leaders, it was so. Now, I was told a story by Claire Short, who was a very good development minister who was in Blair's government, who told me the story of how she was one night talking to Tony Blair about politics generally, and somehow they mentioned the word pollution or something. And one of Claire Blair's children, I think the second son, I'd forgotten the name, had just entered the room at that point to say goodnight, on his way up to bed. And he sort of cut loose and spoke for 5 minutes on the environment, ending up with those words, and that's what you politicians should be caring about. And as I say, I happened to write that in the paper, and then the next week, Blair told the story himself at a UN conference, so I felt vindicated. Corinne and I were talking about the Obama administration, which was very disappointing in my view, despite some of the current mythology, on climate in its first term. In fact, I wrote after one lot of climate negotiations in Durban, I think, when they'd been particularly bad, that they'd turned the slogan, "Yes, we can," to "No, you can't." But I happened to be in DC at the time that of the second election. I think it was election night, yes. Some part of a lot of members of the administration. And they were telling me it'd be different next year, different in the second term. And that was largely because his daughter, Sasha Amalia, had gone after him and given him hell on the climate. And whether that was true, I don't know. He didn't make a speech confirming it, but certainly the second term was very different. And that made a very big difference to the world and really paved the way for the Paris Agreement. So I think the young are particularly important and never to feel powerless, basically.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you. We have a question from Clive Lawton. Clive, can you just unmute and come on and please tell us who you are and then put your question in. And can I encourage others to put your points on chat? Otherwise, I have some people who are WhatsApping me or I'm WhatsApping them. So I'll choose you too. But Clive, please go ahead.
Sounds technologically more sophisticated than I can manage. Okay, well, I'm Clive Lawton. I'm Chief Executive of something called the Commonwealth Jewish Council. We're very concerned about the environment, as is the Commonwealth in general, not least because an awful lot of its members are slowly sinking beneath the waves in the Pacific. And in fact, our current campaign is called Small Islands, Big Challenges. And as Jews, we've espoused that because, first of all, we know what it's like to be a small people, fearing being friendless on the international stage, as so many of those Pacific and Caribbean islands must feel, and to fear the loss of your home and that kind of existential threat. How do you continue to be who you are if you can't be where you belong? And so we feel that, and we want to be friends to them. Anyway, the question is simply that is about religious leadership. So we know lots of people say lots of grand things about what their religions have to say, and there are beautiful teachings in all of our traditions, and those teachings have been articulated by beautiful teachers. But it seems to me that there is generally a kind of disconnect between those grand statements and beautiful teachings, and then the motivating of their co-religionists. There's not a criticism of those leaders necessarily. Maybe they just can't motivate their co-religionists. But the strongest example, I guess, global impact was the Pope's publication of a really inspiring document. And of all, perhaps the Roman Catholic Church has a structure whereby a leader can direct things. And yet I'm not conscious of the Roman Catholic community worldwide becoming sort of a leading vanguard in the environmental thing. And if that can't happen there, who amongst the world's religious leaders is or can unleash the astonishing power that religious communities could have in this? So I'm looking for those people, not least because I want to interview them. But I'd like to know other people's thoughts on that.
So who'd like to respond to that?
Well, it's no good going for the Pope's children anyway. That's one thing that wouldn't work. No, I mean, it's interesting. I touched on this myself. I mean, I was talking earlier before this began about the Greek and Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, who's very, very green. And I was involved with him in doing a number of floating seminars in the oceans of the world, which are wonderful occasions. But the reason I was interested was I thought, in the first place, and helped a bit, was how else do you get down to the grassroots in Russia? How do you get there? Well, surely through the Orthodox Church is the way to do it. But for all his passion, I don't see that it's ever happened. I think in that particular case, it may be schisms and things within the church itself that, he and the Russians didn't exactly get on. But my instinct is it has to be bottom up rather than top down. Unless one has a very, very charismatic and saintly figure who does it. But I was sort of tussling with, sorry, I don't want to go on there. I was tussling what Corella said, the sort of corruption of Christianity that she was mentioning, and how that has happened actually throughout Christian history. I mean, in Britain, the Synod of Whitby, the more naturalist Christian side was suppressed by the more mercantilist side, and now you have all this evangelicals behind both Trump and Bolsonaro and others. I sort of feel it's not going to come top down; it's going to come bottom up. But that's
right.
As far as I can get.
Thanks, Jeff. And Corinna, did you want to? You put yourself forward. Did you want to?
It's such a good question. Thank you. I don't have as good an answer to it as I wish I did, but you've absolutely identified something important, which is that, and in the United States, for example, if you look at the voting blocks and who voted for the most, sort of climate denial president, you'll see that unfortunately, it doesn't reflect well on the influence that Pope Francis might have had, or other Christian leaders who have spoken out in such a way. So I think that it's important to think deeply about how our religions. First of all, I totally agree with Jeff. It's bottom up rather than top down is where the hope lies. And when people really see in their daily lives, remember, the voice of Mother Nature is louder and more consistent. Almost everybody has some direct experience now, or one person removed, of extreme weather events. And so there are people having, I think, more and more theological conversations around their kitchen tables on exactly the topic of, is this God's plan, or is there something we can do about it? And I don't think that we should deride that as a very serious framework that people are wrestling with. And especially when people feel that we're all implicated, right, in this in some way, because if we're using fossil fuels, and many of us, it's not even a matter of airplanes and automobiles, it's the clothing we wear is made of petrochemicals sometimes, and it's just so pervasive, the food systems, as we know, everything. And people really have these thought forms that come, even if they think of themselves as secular, that sometimes come from faith traditions about original sin, right, and about guilt and shame and what one does with that, and see perhaps their faith as a way that you just carbon offset it, or you ask for forgiveness for it, but haven't quite made the leap to the place where the faith is the source of the courage for standing for systemic change. And that's where those lineages and that heritage that goes back in the context of my country, Martin Luther King, a Baptist preacher, people who really brought it to the next level in terms of systemic change. So I think we need to do that, and as much as possible, do that from the bottom up.
Thank you. So Betsy, I'm going to come to you, but I just thought that Adam's question is relevant now. So if that's okay. Adam, do you mind, Adam Parr, Dr. Adam Parr? Pleased to meet you. Do you want to, can we spotlight you, and could you ask your question? Because I think it's connected.
Sure. Well, I think it's wrong to blame religions for not being able to convince their communities to change their attitudes, because I don't think anyone's ever succeeded in changing anyone's attitudes to any great degree. I fear that top-down, unfortunately, may be necessary. But the real proposition I'd like to put to you is that attitudes follow behavior. Behaviors change attitudes, not attitudes change behaviors. Seatbelts is a classic example. If you're waiting for a bottom-up revolution, if people smoke, knowing what it does to their own body, are they really likely to take actions to change things that affect the environment, even if there's quite an immediate impact, as you described, Corinna? So I think, but turning it around positively, religions do understand how to change behaviors, to drill people into routines of prayer and practice so as to develop faith and so forth. So could I maybe just put to the panel, how can we use religious practice to train people to make small sacrifices, to make changes that then get them into the swing of changing the world, rather than just preaching, you should do this, you should do that, you know, in terms of your attitudes, how you see the world, behavior first. So can we use religion to help us do that?
Terrific. And Adam, sorry, would you mind just telling us who you are? It just helps.
I'm a reformed sinner. I spent my career, like Justin Welby, in the resources sector. I ran a Formula One team for half a dozen years. So I've been literally on the dark side. Now I sit in Oxford and work on climate change. I have a charity that I set up to do that. I'm doing a DPhil at the Smith School. So I've always been aware of this, by the way, but I never thought it was a real problem. And now I know it's a serious problem and seriously urgent. So I'm trying to devote more time and effort to that.
Could I invite Rabbi Wittenberg, if you don't mind, to respond to that to Adam's point?
Thank you. And you put it in a way that I wrestle with every single day of my life now. It's become my most sort of pressing question that I wake up with in the morning. Eco-church, eco-synagogue, and its parallels in the Sikh and the Hindu and the Muslim communities have created audits for communities to look at every aspect of their life. Who sources your electricity? What happens with your water? How do you use food? What do you do with your waste? Are you engaged in local, national, and international biodiversity and environmental projects? So it's really looking at directing to communities in everyday actions towards change. But it feels like hard work. Some of the small things are not so difficult, like not using throwaway plastic. But I've also wondered, and I really struggle with this, how tough can one be in what one says to one's community? I was talking to a friend and saying, can I use the line, how many of your grandchildren do you want to kill? And she said, you absolutely can't. You say that Native Americans, when they have a council, think in terms of 7 generations ahead, put it like that. But it doesn't feel quite so powerful. So getting the motivation behind the change is a huge, huge challenge. And I think it's terribly helpful if we constantly exchange between us and across the faiths what has worked, what has been successful, what has shifted attitudes, what has changed behaviors. And I think they're also, I mean, in a way, religions have a record of doing this, as well as do. There are some quite significant don't do messages that we have to give and perhaps not be afraid of giving. But I just want to say I struggle with that issue every day of my life now.
Thank you. And can I just alert, I'm going to come to Betsy in a second, my friend Betsy from Bahrain. But can I just invite Imam Murshad and friends from the Yog Foundation and friends from City Sikhs Network to reflect on this question of religious practice and how that can be engaged towards the end of climate protection. So I'm going to pick on you. But Betsy, please, lovely to see you.
Hello, good evening, everyone.
You tell us who you are, please.
Oh, how am I? Well, I'm Krishy's friend. That's the most important thing to me this evening. Thank you for that introduction, Krish. I live in the Kingdom of Bahrain in the Middle East. I've lived there for 41 years, and I'm the deputy chair of the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence and president of This Is Bahrain, both NGOs based in Bahrain. And I've had the honor of working with Krish to create a version of Faith in Leadership program for young people, which began in Bahrain. And Krish and his team did an incredible job of working with me to create the King Hamad Faith in Leadership Fellows program. Despite the pandemic, we managed to get our first graduates through. And they cannot stop talking about how it's changed their lives. And as Krish knows, we're about to take this to other countries around the world with the support of Faith and Leadership. Anyway, I was intrigued by everything that all of the panelists said. And in our breakout session, I was just saying, I could have listened to all of you all night. You're all incredible speakers, and you touched me in various different ways. Something that stuck out in my mind was something that Karena said. She said that structured evil is masquerading as good. Now, this is something I fight against in my life every day. And it frustrates me that other people can't see this. And I find it difficult to explain to them, look, don't you understand what that means? Blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to use, with your permission, Karina, that phrase, because I think in future it will help me. I was also intrigued with what Gopal said about young people. Now, I have seen this. The Kingdom of Bahrain is an incredibly diverse place. We have every faith in the world here. We have, if you're one person and you have a new religion, you have the right to religious freedom and to worship in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Our Hindu temple is over 200 years old. The Nestorian Christians fled persecution by the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century and came to Bahrain. We are home to the Baha'i religion. We have we had the first, and it was the only synagogue in the Middle East. And so people in Bahrain are used to living together. Now, even those young people who are used to diversity and understanding other faiths, as Gopal noted, we see young people moving away from that traditional, you will pray like this, you will go to mosque, you will go to temple, you will go to church. It's not interesting for them. So we have to find other ways to capture their attention and their intent and turn that in a positive way. And one of the ways that we approach and the environment and the future of peaceful coexistence around the world is through education, because His Majesty the King in Bahrain says that ignorance is the enemy of peace. So all of our programs are working with young people, with youth empowerment and education. And Krish has played a great, important role in this and will continue to do so. Now, his Faith and Leadership Fellows program that we worked on with his wonderful alumni has shown young people who thought they knew everything about living together in peace, has shown them how other people live their lives in a different way. Well, you know, I don't really pray 5 times a day. I know I should, but this is why I don't. But I make up for it, and this is what I do, and I don't feel guilty. My mom thinks I should. This is not just gold. This is platinum for young people to be able to speak and discuss these things freely. And I see, as Krish will, I'm sure, agree, how those young people blossomed throughout this openness. My other point was that I noticed that we all work in a world where we're talking suddenly about diversity, and you know, everyone should have their voice heard and have a place at the table, and absolutely that's correct. And we talk about interfaith work and, you know, interfaith harmony, but an area that is greatly neglected for me is intra-faith. Because if we want to really say, right, let's look at our religions and why, as Krish said, his question intrigued me, why, if we're so good at bringing religions together and groups of people in religion and getting them to follow our religious path, are we not good at getting them to do other things like environmental protection? And I think it's because there are so many fractures within sects of the same faiths. I think we have to work on intra-faith and make people aware of that and bring that group together before we can then bring other groups together. But as the other gentleman before me said, behavior is the way. You know, like children learn by example, by seeing and doing. So my question for the panel, and forgive my long speech, but is, you know, how can we engage those young people and get down to the roots of intra-faith? Because even people within their own faith don't know about intra-faith and how that can affect and change all of us. So I'd like to hear from the different panel members. What can we do to, you know, galvanize young people in such a way? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Betsy, and thank you for the free advertisement. I wasn't expecting that. Gopal, would you like to address? You were vigorously nodding during Betsy's remarks.
Yeah, two really important questions. On the youth question, I think we have to look at it as an opportunity. I think for a lot of faith leaders, we're we're challenged when young people come and say we want to do things in a different way, right? Because we're so used to the status quo, and we've done this for generations. This is how my parents did it in their homeland, or this is how we've done it for hundreds of thousands of years. And we have to be open to the opportunities that young people bring and the energy, and that things need to be different. Things aren't static. The world isn't static. It's a dynamic place. And the young people are coming because they're concerned. They're really worried. I think I'm on the cusp. I'm 38, so I don't know if I'm youth or an adult. I'm probably in both. But young people are very, very worried. And they're worried about their future. They're worried about their health, wellness, their family, opportunities for a career. And they just see the lack of inaction. They see the lack of inaction in politicians, in business. And if they see the lack of inaction in our faith institutions as well, they'll go elsewhere. And they are going elsewhere. They're going to Extinction Rebellion. They're going to Greenpeace and Amnesty and WWF and so on. So we need to be responsive to that change that the young people are calling for. And, I know we're talking about, is it top down? Is it bottom up? I personally like to say the approach of both. It's both and. You need the messaging coming from the top, the signaling from the religious leaders that we are for example, no longer using plastic plates in our places of worship, or that we are encouraging people to cycle to the place of worship rather than car driving or something. So you need the high level signaling, but you also need the nudges from the grassroots that enables people to make that change, right? So do we have electric car chargers in our places of worship, right? Do we have enough recycling bins in our places of worship? Really simple things, but we forget and we think, just by saying something, everyone will follow. And we know that's not true. So I think we need to have both, and the high level signaling, the moral reasoning, the theology, but also it's almost like the practical things on the ground, that when people come to our places of worship or when they go back to their homes, they can live out those lifestyles. Right? We're very good at making sure everyone's got a Bible in their home, or making sure everyone's got an altar in their spare bedroom or something like that. We're very good at making sure they have all their religious resources they need at home. Can we make sure they have the environmental resources they need at home as well? And can we mirror those in the places of worship? So I think those are some of the key things we could do to kind of bridge that top down, bottom up. Yeah.
Really helpful. Murshad, I'm going to pick on you as a young imam. I'm just on that question of religious practice. Can you address that?
Yes. Thank you, Krish. I wasn't expecting to be called on, and as I said in the breakout room, sometimes it's nice to be an observer than yapping away. But no, definitely, I think some of the thoughts today, it's just very humbling. As I said in the breakout room, the fact that so many of us have gathered here today, just a testament to how much interest there is to see genuine change occurring in this arena. I was scribbling some notes earlier as well. I was just reflecting what Rabbi Jonathan had said about, the whole communal element of how do we say things and approach our communities. And I think perhaps maybe as someone who's been involved in the faith community from a young age, I think from at least my own experience, many times we undermine the optimism of the community to do things because we have a perception of how they may react if we are to ask them to do something. In the case of, I guess, the whole environmental movement, I remember, Kari Arson referred to it as well on a Friday sermon. I mentioned about it. And the reality was so many people approached me afterwards saying, well, what can we do? We're happy, we're ready to go for it. We want to make those changes. So I think sometimes ridding of assumptions that maybe people might not react to in a certain way, or be as ready to take on that approach, is something that we probably need to break down as an assumption and actually just open up and be quite honest about it. Because the reality, again, as Rabbi Jonathan said, the reality is one way or another, this planet is boiling up to a point that we're not going to be able to live on it. And if we're not quite honest about that dialogue, we're going to be in for a very nasty shock. The other thing, I guess, again, with another cap on from a 9-to-5 experience, working on sustainability as well. One of the things that, of course, all industries are actively doing is having a roadmap to 2050 as part of the net zero strategy. And again, it might be due to my ignorance, but one of the things that I think has come up amongst younger imams or faith leaders across all, all denominations and genders, is why don't we have something like that within our interfaith communities? Why don't we have a collective roadmap? If we are to be saying, yes, let's do this, why wait for, on a government level, to see these practical changes? If we as community leaders say, you know what, I'm a representative of Nottingham, I'm a representative of the Sikh community in Cardiff, this is a collective net zero 2050 faith roadmap, whether it might be how we eat, how we drink, how we clothe ourselves, how we home ourselves, all of those things are part of a strategy that we work towards, and come back in every 5 years for a check-in or a 2-year check-in and say, are we meeting that strategy? I think that's on a practical level, as you mentioned, Krish, what are we thinking about? Yeah. And I think that's a conversation that we've been having, and hopefully maybe we can allude to it further in this gathering or another one later. Thanks, Krish.
Thank you. So we're approaching the last few minutes, and I just want to get as many people in as possible. This always happens. There's a silence, and then all these amazing questions come. So I'm going to do the following. Can we have Michael Hilton, Rabbi Michael Hilton, welcome. Quickly say who you are and then put your question. And then the other side to it, as it happens, is through Sue Radford's point. So we'll have both those. And then I want to alert Bhavan, who's doing something very effective with young people about mobilizing, to make a point on mobilizing young people, if you have any advice on that. And then I want to hear Habi's and Faisal's points as well. So, so on that, Michael, please.
Thank you, Krish, and it's really great to be here. Absolutely fascinating how you've managed to assemble such an incredible group from around the world. I'm here as the Jewish lead for Oxford Three Faiths Week, which is working on these issues, and we're very privileged to be working with St. Benet's. Talking about this question of how faith leaders can persuade parishioners, congregants, people in the community to do more, I often get stuck on the question of flying across the world to go on holiday. Now, I do it very rarely myself, but I find that when I mention this to other people, it just gets shrugged off. And it seems to me there's a gap between the little things like recycling that people, oh yeah, I can do that. When you ask them to do something which is not enormous, but just a little bit bigger, really they're not going to do it. And this can be so disappointing and so demoralizing, getting people to just go that little bit further.
Absolutely. So, but the inference is that the right thing is to tell people not to fly. Sue, please tell us who you are and give us your point.
Thank you.
Rebel that you are, yeah.
I always have been, actually. So I work currently for Intermission Youth Theatre, an amazing organisation, charity, working using theatre, filmmaking and drama to support very disadvantaged 16 to 25-year-old people from ethnic diverse communities in London. I've worked in corporate sector, I've worked in the not-for-profit sector, and I've been a broadcast journalist in my past. So jack of all trades, master of absolutely none of them. But whilst I agree that we can give dictates, etc., to people, I just think people are absolutely sick to death currently of being told what to do, especially following COVID with all the countless guidelines. And also, I understand the part, Michael, about not flying across the world, and it's great that you're modelling that. I think it's incredibly hard however, when you see politicians and other leaders, maybe not faith leaders, but other leaders who are just jettisoning that and, not actually necessarily following that path. And I also think, okay, so you might not fly overseas, but say in the north of Scotland currently, over route, whatever it's called, I can't quite remember now, but they've got a terrible impact there of people who are taking domestic holidays in Great Britain, going up to Scotland and completely sort of destroying the environment up there, with so many people trying to camp and holiday make and not having very basic facilities, and destroying the environment currently at the moment. I think it's a really hard one. People are just fed up with being told do this, do that, do the other. And I don't have anything positive to say other than I think we can influence through things like art, through things like drama, through creating discussion and debate and hearing the attitudes and voices, especially of young people.
So is that, I mean, the answer that people haven't really come to is the economic one, which is that, you know, maybe we need to, I mean, this is what the three faith leaders, their statement talks about, it kind of envisages, they don't quite say it, but they refer to a new kind of economy where you make money by caring or by, liberalizing ownership of assets that are owned by too few people and should be, owned by the many. Councillor Kanti Rabadia, we have a Conservative councillor and a dear friend. Do you want to address that, or whatever that comes to your mind?
Yeah, thanks, Krish. So I think Sue was in my group, so she might have heard me speak anyway. So I think some of the ideas, so we did mention hypocrisy, and effectively, I must say, it's not just politicians, it's everyone really. And I made quite a few points about that, sort of, it's across the board. Because some of the points I mentioned was that, look, in terms of the way the life is going, I expect by now to have resolved this problem, because if I look around my house, my fridge is more efficient, so is my car, so is my light bulb, so is my washing machine, so is my boiler. So I'm asking the question, so what is this argument? Because we've been at it for so long. I mean, we were speaking about the ozone layer in the 1990s, but last I checked, it's completely perfect now. So what happened there? I mean, what did we change? I don't know. So from my viewpoint, and yes, I'm an elected politician and sitting right now, so I have to be very careful, I say. But one thing I bring is sort of, how do I scrutinize? So I sit on scrutiny panels, I sit on governance, on audit, and so on. So the question I have is, when I'm collecting information, that it has to be valid, it has to be accurate, correct. So one of the problems I see about targets, for example, as well, is that what is the current measurement of everything? How do you measure it? So, and how then can you say in 5 years' time we achieved this? So that's not in place. So when that's not in place, it's very vague and iffy. So it's hard to sort of quantify and measure and make people connect to that. So it's very difficult, yes. The other thing I might just sort of point out while I've been given the mic, sorry, Krish, if I overrun by a few seconds.
Point, yeah, go on.
Is that religion or whoever, in this situation, I will, from my viewpoint, call you a lobbyist. So if you don't understand your role, because from the environment perspective, you have to, like we heard about bottom up. So you have to work with your local councils and authorities, because that's where the small decisions start, which can impact the sort of bigger decisions higher up nationally. So temples, churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever your place of worship. So you have to be actively involved in sort of, your projects, your ideas, your petitions, your lobbying. So all these little things. And this is one way of connecting the youth, because youth like sort of something that's different. That's not sort of what your parents do. So they like a bit of sort of, edge. That's why during these revolutions on the streets are there. So I think that might be a small step I can suggest, that when you connect that religious ethos and aspects of what you want to achieve at a local level, then, it's a good starting point. And you're more effective and you're relevant, because you have then connected your role as faith leaders to what the local politics does, and it's a way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanti. And I take your point on measurement. Quick points. Can I have, I'm sorry, Julie, you're going to be furious with me because I'm changing the order, but can we have Habi? So Ha Patel is what her thing is. Habi's question, and then the very good one on, so we've got two pragmatists here, Habi, and then Faisal. And then I'm going to ask Pavan to say something inspiring about his youth work, and then the panelists will have the final say to respond to all of that and give us the answers. So, Habi, please.
Thanks, Krish. And just a very quick thank you to all the participants and contributors and the speakers. It's been an excellent discussion. So, very humble thank you. I think my question is... Tell
us what you do, Habi, sorry.
So I am General Counsel for Save the Children. And I've spent a tale of two halves in terms of my professional career. So I did come from the dark side and spent 10 years in the corporate sector, and then moved over to the not-for-profit sector and have worked with a number of faith-based international NGOs, and before moving over to Save the Children. So I've spent the last 10 years or so in development, which probably then gives a degree of context to where my question is coming from. So I guess three things. First of all, I am very results-based, which is the pragmatism. The second is it's very clear that time is not on our side in relation to this. So if you're a results-based individual at the best of times, that's honed in at the worst of times, and this feels like we don't have the luxury of time. And a lot of people have touched on issues around, people flying, but that comes from a position of real privilege. You're in a position to fly and get on a plane. This is not a proportionate use of means of travel that's felt equitably. And so my question is very much driven by two things that drive me. One is accountability, and the second is addressing inequality. And the question is, based on that pragmatism and not at all on a point of principle, are all faiths equal in their responsibility to contribute to changing these attitudes, where responsibility for climate crisis is disproportionately contributed to across the globe?
Thank you. Thanks. Faisal?
Yeah, I'm Faisal Chowdhury. I presently work for the Bank of England, where I am on secondment to lead the trade union there. Previously, I worked for Her Majesty the Queen at Buckingham Palace, where I was leading the IT function. My question, if I may,
if the computers of the Queen went haywire, it was Faisal's fault, really. So go ahead, Faisal. Yeah.
And also my responsibility to fix them. Thanks, Chris. So my question, if I may, is, given that human population growth has been attributed to the climate change that we are seeing presently, and also that human populations across the world is likely to increase to 10 billion, balance that with a number of faiths that espouse propagation and increasing the numbers. Are those two things in conflict with one another when we look at the impact it has on the environment of having that many humans living on the planet? Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. Point made. Great. Bhavan, do you want to say anything wise about just working with young people? Because
yeah, I will do, but before I do that, there's an interesting reference to the corporate sector as being the dark side. But when it comes to, I think, the environment and climate, actually, I think there's a few things the faith sector can actually learn from. There's the triple bottom line. So now with the corporate sector, which I'm in as well, is assessing more than just profit, but it's also thinking about people. It's thinking about the planet as well, being the third aspect of the triple bottom line. And the other thing to say is how ESG is becoming more prominent as a measure for shareholders and investors for how they make their investment decisions as well. I just wanted to touch on that, given my participation in the corporate sector as well. But when it comes to young people, I mean, we just ran the Hindu Youth Leadership Program, the inaugural Hindu Youth Leadership Program, with the help of Chris Ravel and Faith and Leadership at St. Benet's Hall, and it was remarkable. And the three things that I can. I'm no longer young, but I can certainly say, based on my experience in working with young people, is it's not words. It's not about words. It's not about what we say. It's not about the the dialogue. It's much more about what we do and what we listen to. It's less about speaking. It's more about doing. It's more about listening. Really, I think, and I think some of the panelists already touched on this, we've kind of lost the young generation already as faith and religious groups being something that's not very relevant, too spiritual, too detached. And so therefore environment, climate is something that's just too far of a leap for faith or religious groups to address. And I think we have a role to play in addressing that directly. Even on Varicesva, the youth leadership program, we made a point in the sense that the food was vegetarian, or therefore not animal based, and the reason for that being ethical as well as climate. Also, the cutlery and
yeah.
Sorry,
the last
plate.
point. Yeah.
plates and cutlery being biodegradable and things as well. So it's much more about the practical steps we take and the time we take to listen to the young people's concerns as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and it seems to me that in societies there are, in every community there are those people who young people listen to, whether it's somebody running the laundry or somebody in the cafeteria or somebody reaching out. And it's those people, if they could be agents of environmental change, then you could harness a kind of revolution in that way. Okay, we're going to extend by a few minutes so that I give my amazing panel the last word on what they've heard. So can I invite Gopal to start, please?
Sure, thank you, Krish. Great contributions there as well. I think my departing shot, my final shot is, someone said it, is that we have power as faith groups. And I think a time has come where we really need to exercise that in ways that maybe is not comfortable for us or is maybe new for us. I'm going to speak from a Hindu perspective. COP26 is in the UK. The UK is the president of COP26. The president of COP is Alok Sharma, who's a Hindu. You have two other high-profile Hindus in the cabinet. Where's the pressure on them to live up to caring for the planet? And so I think that's the evolution that faith institutions, I really believe, need to make, is that hold elected leaders to account on their policies, but they're all people of faith or morals or ethics. And I think if we can do that, we can start seeing the changes that we need to see. The other thing I would say is that COP26 is only one moment. It's in 2 months. It'll be over once it starts in 2 weeks, and the world will go back to normal and it'll be back to COVID and stuff. But the climate crisis is going to continue. And we need to keep our eye on the ball and see what comes after COP, make sure the British government and any other country that we're living in is living up to what it says it's going to do. Because at COP, new agreements will be made, new commitments will be made by every single government in the world, but they'll only live up to them if we as faith institutions, as civil society, hold them to account. So that's really, I think, really, really important for us. It's not just focus on COP, but what comes after. Let's hold them to account. Because if we don't, if the religious leaders let them have a free pass to not living up to their commitments, then they'll do whatever they want. And so I really, really hope that's something that we can do as a community together.
Thank you so much. Jeff?
Well, look, I'm going to rain on the parade a bit. I think the people who've been most delighted by our recent conversation, much of the last half hour, will be the major polluters and the climate deniers. Because I think we've been falling into a big trap, which is to boil everything down to individual action, whether you fly or not, whether you use plastic cutlery or not, when what is needed is systems change. And there is an unholy alliance between some rather more Puritan environmentalists and the big businesses to get people us talking only about that and only about what we're doing in our personal lives, which enables then the deniers to attack anybody who isn't living in a cave on berries as being a hypocrite for, driving a car or whatever it happens to be. And it's happening all the time. Now, I'm all for walking the talk, and I speak as someone who built a carbon negative house 10 years ago when these things weren't done with great pain. So I believe in walking the talk, but don't let's get distracted from the need for change. And people will change, not when they're told not to do something like flying, but when the other side is more alternative, the alternative is more attractive. Now, my house, for example, was the first in Britain to be run entirely on LED lights. They're much cheaper, they're much better than ordinary lights. You have to change them. Electric cars cost half as much to run as petrol cars. They're more expensive at the moment, but they'll come down. They'll be cheaper. They're nicer to drive. All these things are going to be beneficial, but we have to get the systems changed that makes it happen. We have to get governments to do things like saying other cars are going to be banned by 2030 in order to get the manufacturers interested in producing the better alternatives. So for heaven's sake, let's be distracted by all this stuff. And we don't have to tell people not to do things. We need to tell people to do things that they will enjoy doing and will benefit them and give them better lives as well as saving the planet.
Yeah, well, that's not raining on our parade. That's constructive suggestions. Thanks. Karina?
Well, thank you so much. I've greatly enjoyed this whole gathering. Grateful to be here. I would say that we're now in a different phase of this movement where people are experiencing the effects of the climate crisis so much more broadly than before. And we are in a conversation where there are a lot of people who are discussing things at the level of effect rather than the level of cause. There's a lot of talk about adaptations and so on. We have to realize that it's not just climate denial that is the problem. It's the form of thinking about this, that it's just too complicated to take the measures that are necessary, and the kind of watering down of possible and false solutions. And so I really think that we need to be looking and be relentless at the level of cause, and really looking at those main drivers of the climate crisis. And of course, that is systemic. That is the major polluters. That is about holding the financial system responsible, that is providing the money to continue the absolutely insane build out continually of fossil fuels. I also think that that we need to look within faith communities to really address this most root cause and core problem, which is the illusion that we're separate from nature, that humanity is separate and superior from the natural world. It is, we almost take it for granted in the ways that it manifests. But to the extent that in our faith communities and cultures, we can make it a point to make those traditions, whether it's baptism or sacraments of other kinds, whatever it is in your context, actually filled with the meaning of connection. That reconnection to the natural world has power and force of its own. And I really believe that that the changes that we need to make in order to restore balance are changes that will bring a more beautiful, just, fair world. And that there is this great amount of what we don't even see or measure as wealth now in our current system that is just waiting to be claimed if we live more equitably and in balance. And we know that that's actually very, very real for the most vulnerable people in the world who are living with the pollution that is harming their health. But I believe that it's actually also true for people who are living in privilege, in high consuming cultures and situations, that there is actually a deprivation in the lack of connection to culture, community, and nature. And that what we have to offer is beautiful, powerful, real. So thank you again so much. Looking forward to working. I hope to meet many of you all in person one day, and we're all in this together. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Karina. And you referred to the 20th century fallacy that we've somehow, overcome or conquered nature. And I think all our faith traditions actually have a very serious riposte to that. And if we had followed, COVID wouldn't have occurred. So maybe there's some lessons from the way we've handled COVID and the interconnectedness that the pandemic has, shown us that we can adopt in the environmental space. The discussion can continue in a moment informally. The chat room will remain open for anyone that wants to remain. But I want to give the last word to Professor Richard Cooper, the Master of St. Benet's Hall. And can I just say it's been a privilege to see so many new and old friends. And thank you to the panelists. You're amazing. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. I should be very brief because everybody's going to rush off to help to stimulate the French wine producers and so on at this sort of time of day. But I think let's take what are we taking for granted and don't need to rehearse. The climate disasters. I think we're all quite clear what's happening. Disasters to biodiversity, and these are unfortunate examples of the misuse of human ingenuity. We're able to do things and we don't stop ourselves from doing them. And we're going to need to be more ingenious so that I think, and the effects on the poor and so on, somehow clearly need more attention. I think we've made some progress against the climate deniers. There were people who used to claim that, the climate crisis was a myth. It was all invented and by sandal-wearing lefties. And I think we're gradually winning that one. Where we're not winning, I think, is those who continue to justify the damage that's done by continuing to advocate, for instance, lots more nitrates poured on the land, because that's the only way we're going to increase yield and feed the world. Or let's have more coal supply. This is a British problem at the moment, more coal mines or more oil exploration, because that will help create jobs in particular areas. Or keep the lights on. Or those who argue that you need to cut down trees so you can produce palm oil, or it's good for ranching, or it's help us to open up mineral resources and so on. All of these areas I think are still being argued about, and I think there's a lot more to be done there. So I think we've been able this evening to find a lot of common ground from the different faiths. That nature is given to man, I think, and it's for our use, but it's not just for our use, nor is our sense of dominion unlimited. We have a very clear commitment to stewardship, that it has to have a long-term view rather than a quick view. For future generations, we kept talking about our grandchildren, and the sharing of resources, the sharing of wealth, and of course, highly topical at the moment, the sharing of the product of human ingenuity, things like vaccines. And the longer term element as well is the notion of sustainability. So I think that's where we've made a lot of progress and found common ground here. And also quite clearly in the areas of advocating cooperation and seeking ways to cooperate. Now, what have we been looking at? What is the faith angle on all of this, on responsibility, stewardship, and the longer term vision? And one of the problems I think was just raised up towards the end is, of course, not all faiths agree that population explosion is a problem. And I think pretty well most people would take the view that there are too many of us, but other people would say, no, we need lots and lots more souls to be saved and so on. And Abraham was told to multiply till he's as many of the sands of the stars and so on. I think that's an area where faith has been suggested, get its act together on this one, because there is a strong sense here of sustainability and stewardship and so on. So, however, it's wonderful that just this week, the three great Christian leaders have come together with a statement which has come from the Church of England, the Holiness of the Pope, and the Orthodox Patriarch, which has got some very, very good points in it. And it does answer Betsy's point. There is some movement towards intra-faith discussion. And it would be wonderful to see that the organizations we've been hearing about from other faiths joining in and adding their voice before COP26. What has also been a wonderful thing to inspire us all with hope is that the young are being energized. I think if the old aren't doing anything because they think it's too late for them, or it's the time for the energetic young, people like Greta Thunberg are getting a voice. And even though there is a radical, should we say, called what people call eco-terrorists of Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace and others and so on, they're expressing an important element that something needs to be done. And I think it's great if it can be done within our existing structures without burning everything down. So we've had a debate between motivating individuals, which is bottom up, and motivating, some people would say, well, it's no use motivating individuals because the individual is too small. We can only make a very, very marginal impact. Look at the big polluters. Let's get the great country, and I shan't name any, or the industries and so on. And there are now with new technology, you can see where the methane's coming from, where the CO2 is coming from, and point to it quite quickly. So we know what the problem is. What the impact of the individual is quite clearly very little compared to the impact of the big polluters, but it's not a reason for not doing anything. The churches, we're encouraged to tell each other, the churches, the various faiths, to use their power. Faith groups do have a penetration to at least 80% of the world's population, the influence they could have on the big polluters. And it's important as we come to COP26 to use all the means to mobilize and to use the media, and bearing in mind that there are now the great international organizations like the United Nations, G7, G20, World Health Organization, FAO, UNESCO, and so on, which can also be mobilized. I'd like to add, it's wonderful that so many are on this call, and it's a tribute to Faith and Leadership and Krish and his team. Krish is a good example of what I hope is green, renewable, sustainable energy, which can, he himself seems never to tire and keeps on driving us all forward. And I think it's wonderful. He's gathered together, and what Faith and Leadership does is gather people from different faiths, engaging with the young future leaders. It's so important. As we've heard, there was just one with young Muslims, and publicizing and making a noise. That strikes me as so important. And St. Benet's is very proud to be part of this, to help to promote discussion and find ways to make the difference. If I can just add a word from the rule of St. Benedict, since perhaps the most important 2 words from St. Benedict is listen carefully. I think a crucial thing is we're able to do is to listen to each other, and perhaps having done that, we can move to action and use our power. Thank you all very much.
So, Julie, are we going to go into? So, feel free. This is not ended if you don't want it to end. So, Julie, over to you. And can I just thank Julie, our extraordinary producer, who's just kept us on track. And we're only 13 minutes late, so this is remarkable by faith standards. So, please, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Krish. And thank you all the speakers, and thank you all for joining us. As Krish said, you are all very welcome to stick around and continue the conversation. I am just going to let the speakers into a little breakout room of their own so they can just say goodbye to each other and all that. But they'll probably rejoin you soon. So please feel free to stick around. Thanks for joining us. And that is all from us.